Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Seeger.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Jesse Coeuenhoven about Augustine's views of free will, moral responsibility, and predestination.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Jesse Coeuenhoven, professor of moral theology at Villanova University. Jesse has written extensively on Augustine and free will, including in the chapter on Augustine in the Rutledge Companion to Free Will, and then especially in his book, Striken by Sin, Cured by Christ, Agency, Necessity, and Culpability in Augustinian Theology, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. He's also the author of a book called Predestination, A Guide for the Perplexed, published by T&T Clark Bloomsbury in 2018. And that book includes discussion of Augustine's views on free will and predestination, as well as several other figures in the Christian theological tradition. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Jesse. Welcome to the show. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'm a professor at Villanova University, which I think I got because I work on Augustine. So thank you, Augustine. Shockingly, I believe this may be my 21st year at Villanova. So it's been a great stretch. But I got interested in the topic of free will and Augustine when I was in undergrad at Oberlin College. I was kind of afraid actually to take philosophy or religion courses. So I don't think I took any my first year. Because I was like, I don't know if I can trust these guys. And like, what's the point of that anyway? But I was always deeply interested in psychology. And increasingly, my psych profs kept telling me, like, your questions can't be answered empirically. You're not going to be good at this.
That means you're asking the right questions.
I'll take philosophy. And I read in an intro philosophy course, I read Kant's Groundwork. And I thought, this has got to be wrong. This doesn't feel like my experience at all. I'm not like a rational being of the sort that seems to be discussed in this text. And I think in the same class we read Iris Murdoch as well in The Sovereignty of Good, and she caricatures Kant's autonomous individual as already having been depicted by Milton as Lucifer in
Paradise Lost.
In Paradise Lost. So that I was like, wow, that's punchy. But also, I liked the way she thought about agency more. Her focus was not so much on choices, but what we find ourselves able to pay attention to. And I kind of thought, oh, that's insightful. Like a lot happens before you even notice that you've done anything. Because some things are in your field of vision, as it were, and others aren't. And when I started reading Augustine, I read Augustine initially out of ethical interests. I was trying to figure out if I should be a pacifist. My father had been a conscientious objector, and I ended up rooming with a Quaker at Oberlin, and we had all these discussions about war and peace and stuff. So I was like, why don't I just do a reading project on just war theory? And so I did, and that's kind of how I got assigned to read Augustine. But I started getting interested in his ideas about agency, which seemed to me that they were just intriguing. One last thing is I was raised in the context of a religious holiness movement. My parents didn't really subscribe to this, but many of the people they hung out with did. And there was a sense that we ought to be seeking a perfect life. And this was something I really struggled with in college and tried to figure out, like, what should my aspirations be for myself? And how hard should I be on myself for my clear imperfections? And so I think partly reading Augustine and thinking about free will was a way for me to reflect on my own imperfect agency, but then also to ask questions about what sorts of expectations, what's the standard of expectation that I ought to have for myself and others.
Yeah, very cool. Well, longtime listeners of the podcast will have heard Augustine's name mentioned several times. For example, David Hunt referred to Augustine several times in our discussion of sourcehood libertarianism. But could you give a bit of historical context for the discussion? When did he live? Who were some of his influences? What are some of his most widely read texts, or any other background that you think might be helpful?
Absolutely. I think I've talked to David Hunt about this in the past, maybe at FSU or something related to that, a grant that was hosted there. But anyway, those conversations were helpful, but I think David's wrong. So we'll talk about, or maybe he's right about like something. I'll give him that. Yeah, we'll talk about that more. So Augustine, his personal story, everybody knows, I think, in a way that his personal story is fascinating and is discussed in his Confessions. But there's even more to it, I think, than is widely known. So let me start with some context. He died in the waning years of the western half of the Roman Empire in about 430 after the death of Christ. And he lived quite a long life. So he was born in 354. And during his whole life, pretty much this part of the empire, at least, was weakening the whole time. Like the capital of Rome, the Roman Empire had to be moved actually away from Rome to Milan. So during Augustine's life, the capital was in Milan. And then, of course, famously during Augustine's life in 410, Rome was sacked by barbarians. So there are all these crises happening in the empire during Augustine's life. And I think that's important. Mm-hmm. Also, although we typically think of Augustine as Western, he grew up actually in Africa, and he also died in Africa. And in fact, he lived almost his entire life in Africa with a very brief sojourn to the heart of power in Milan. So he was born in a small port town called Tagaste, and it was kind of close to the famous conquered city of Carthage. So Augustine grew up probably speaking a Carthaginian dialect, Punic. In his old age, he was actually mocked by an Italian, one of his so-called Pelagian opponents, who called him the Punic Aristotle, and that was not a compliment. Like, oh yeah, the conquered loser people think that you're like as smart as Aristotle, but it shows what they know. And then in his youth, actually, he was also mocked by some of his students who didn't think his Latin accent sounded quite right because they knew what proper like Italian Latin sounded like. And so he had to kind of overcome his Africanness when he made it to Milan to kind of like achieve his career success. The other thing that people I think don't know is that Augustine's mother was probably Berber, and they are the indigenous people of Libya. There's still Berbers around. I think they were suppressed by Gaddafi. And so he was deeply African in significant ways, but of course he was also deeply Roman. So he reports that he was inspired in school by reading Cicero's lost book Hortensius. Yeah. He was deeply inspired by Neoplatonic views. So he's a really fascinating combination of Roman and non-Roman influences. Mm-hmm. And everybody kind of knows that in the Confessions he was worried about lust. Yeah. But actually, I think the key focus in his Confessions, if you read it carefully, is actually ambition. Career success is what drives him. And also his parents. So his parents figured out when he was really young that he seemed really smart. And they basically invested all of their money in his education and sent him to the best places they could afford. And he was going to kind of like become influential and then take care of the family. Yeah. That was the goal. So, and he basically, the project was to turn him into something like a lawyer / motivational speaker. So he's going to be this rhetorician in Milan. And in fact, he does end up achieving this goal after some various ups and downs. And he makes it to Milan and he speaks to some pretty influential figures there before then famously giving up on it all. Right. Along the way, as part of his career project, his mother actually pressured him to give up. He had kind of like a common law marriage with probably another African woman who was the mother of his beloved son Adeodatus, who passed away in his youth. So we don't hear about Adeodatus in Augustine's later writings, but he's very important to Augustine early on. And the reason that his mother wanted him to leave this lover behind was that she wanted him to marry up. Mm-hmm. And so he ended up getting engaged to this 14-year-old from better society who he didn't really know. And then once he converted to Christianity, he basically was like, forget that. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then he went back to Africa, where the local people drafted him essentially into becoming their priest. He famously wept after they elected him their priest. His days of study and contemplation were over.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about his context and his personal history. Just quickly about his influence. These days we make hard and fast distinctions between philosophy and theology, but for Augustine and the people in his day, that would be just a completely foreign distinction. There was no difference between theology and philosophy.
Yeah.
And originally, Augustine probably converted to something more like what we would think of as Neoplatonism. And so that the conversion that he records in the Confessions is a deeply philosophical conversion. It's to Christianity, but he hasn't actually read much of the Bible. So he spends quite a lot of time in his early years after his conversion, hosted by a wealthy friend who basically is like, let's talk about stuff.
Right.
And they read the Bible, and that had a big impact on Augustine. Mm-hmm. So he's best known for his books, The Confessions, which are in many ways the invention of the autobiographical genre. And then City of God, which he writes after the fall of Rome in response to criticisms that Christian virtues had destroyed the manliness of Rome and wasn't permitting Rome to be militaristic and defend itself. For my work on free will, I think two really important and often underappreciated texts are really late ones. On Grace and Free Choice is a nice short summary text that he wrote very close to the end of his life, at a point where he had finally kind of figured out what he wanted to say. It took him a long time to get, I think, a consistent view put together. And then if you really want to be geeky about it, he writes these two large works against Julian, his big Pelagian opponent. And they're incredibly tedious to read because there's all this repetition, but they're also, I think, philosophically fascinating because Julian is, I think, a pretty articulate libertarian. And smart enough that Augustine can't just run rhetorical circles around him. So if Augustine says something fancy, Julian can call him out on it. And so Augustine is forced to, I think through his position. And in a way, Julian is like really good for him.
Yeah. Was that written before or after On Grace and Free Will?
Before. Well, there are two works against Julian, and one of them is unfinished, and Augustine died while he was working on it. So they're all kind of happening at the same time. I think the first work against Julian is before, if I'm remembering correctly, but then the second one. What happens is that Augustine and Julian keep accusing each other of misrepresenting their positions, a common problem in philosophy. So Augustine's, I still think, hilarious solution in the unfinished work is, fine, I will quote your entire previous book and respond to every single line. So the best text that we have by the Pelagians is preserved by Augustine.
Nice.
And I think the rhetorical conventions of the day require Augustine and Julian never to say, yeah, okay, we've been over this, so let's move on.
Right.
So like every single time one of them says something, the other one says, as I have said before, I cannot believe I have been forced to respond to you on this point so many times, but let me just say again, and then they go through the whole thing over and over again. So it's really, really a long work, which I guess is why Augustine never quite completed it.
And maybe why you don't hear much about that one.
Like I say, it can be tedious, and Augustine's, they're both like annoyed with each other, so they can be kind of polemical, but it's also just fascinating stuff because they really are actually thinking hard, and they're citing examples from both everyday Christian practice and scripture, and occasionally showing off their knowledge by citing important like Stoic or Platonic figures from Rome. And so there's just a lot in there. Actually, if you put the labor in, I think, I don't know, I found it rewarding. Other people have said that I was brave and foolhardy. It's interesting stuff.
I've seen a lot of people contrast those later works of Augustine on free will with one of his earliest books on free choice of the will, which probably is more well known and more widely read today. It is a lot shorter and less.
It's way shorter. I mean, that's a good reason why it's well known.
It's an easier read. It's an easier read the way it's written too.
You can't make undergraduates. The later stuff is just too hard to read.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, maybe some of the, like, if there's any differences or developments or clarifications kind of across his work on free will, maybe some of that will come up later. I wanted to ask
Absolutely.
before we kind of dig into his view on free will. I wanted to say, one, Augustine might be a little less well known to our audience than, say, Plato or Aristotle, but Augustine is incredibly influential in the Christian tradition. And not just in the Christian tradition. I mean, some of his ideas show up in the modern period. For example, Descartes is indebted to him in a lot of ways. And he has a massive influence on the medieval period and the Protestant Reformation. And you mentioned Confessions. That's still widely read today. What would you say are some of Augustine's most influential ideas?
Yeah, that's it's a great. I mean, it's kind of hard to summarize because there are so many of them. Honestly, as I was thinking about this question, I should note that he's particularly influential in the West, in Western thought, in Western Christianity. Over time, many Eastern Christians took a disliking to Augustine, the ones who spoke Greek rather than Latin. So in that part of the Roman Empire, Augustine was less positively influential.
Sure.
In fact, many Orthodox Christians kind of distinguish themselves from Catholic and Protestants by saying that they say, they believe whatever was the opposite of what Augustine had to say. So no original sin, for instance.
Right.
But so in that sense, you can see how important he has been for a long time because he's this distinguishing figure. You can kind of mark your view by relating it to Augustine. And in Aquinas' Summa Theological, there are two figures who are basically always right. I mean, there's Jesus and stuff like that. But then two regular humans, Aristotle is Aquinas' philosopher who's always right. And then the theologian who's always right is Augustine.
Nice.
And again, you just can't ever say that you disagree with him. Maybe you twist his view a little bit or something like that. But again, that really shows the status that Augustine had.
Right.
For our purposes, I think it's probably right to say that Augustine was the first really articulate and consistent compatibilist about free will. And that has had an absolutely massive influence on all kinds of figures throughout the long history since his life. But he also set the course for Catholic and Protestant ideas about how God redeems humanity from sin. So his doctrine of salvation by grace, his ideas about original sin, his views about predestination, those all become kind of like standard in Western Christianity. And some of them are officially endorsed by a variety of councils, even basically during Augustine's lifetime. For instance, in the Pelagian controversy, Augustine pretty much wins that one from an official standpoint. And so, yeah, he had a huge impact on what we like to call soteriological topics in Christian thought, but also a huge influence on how the West generally has thought about the self. So what kind of a being is a human person? And his ideas about the interior sense of oneself, the ability to have a monologue inside your own head, or a dialogue, inside your head with yourself. Those are things that show up in especially the Confessions, but other works too, in very influential ways. And then lastly, he had a really fundamental impact on the Western political imagination.
Yeah.
There's a British theologian named Oliver O'Donovan who has said that Augustine is one of the earliest figures to articulate what O'Donovan calls the doctrine of the two, which is basically, to simplify, like separation of church and state. So the sense that God has given different powers and tasks to the church and to the state, and that they are both serving God, but in different respects. And that is one of the things that is expressed in City of God as well as other works. So in all of those ways, I think Augustine, it's hard to overstate the influence that Augustine had.
For sure. Well, you've already mentioned his influence in free will as a compatibilist. So as we segue into Augustine on free will, unlike, say, Plato or Aristotle, Augustine emphasizes the role of the human will. Can you say a little bit about what the will is for Augustine and what it means for the will to make a free choice?
Yeah, absolutely. So here it's important, as you guys already mentioned, that one of his early, mercifully short treatises is on the free choice of the will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really important formulation that he kind of changes his views about how the will works over time. But the language of there being such a thing as the will that has a free choice, that's consistent. And also the linking between the free choice and the will.
Yeah.
And here I think it kind of is helpful to have some Latin. My Latin is actually pretty bad, but it can be, I think, misleading when we think about will or free choice. I think, well, you guys have talked to all kinds of people, so I'm curious. Maybe I wonder if you think this is true, but I feel like the intuition in the American context is when you talk about free choice, it means having alternative possibilities, like intuitively to an awful lot of, I don't know, like your ordinary undergraduate student or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common.
Yeah. And then with the will, I think a lot of times we think of a fairly integrated volitional faculty. And Augustine doesn't think of the will like that at all. So it's just important to keep in mind that although we translate the word voluntas as will, we should be careful not to map our presumptions onto it. And we translate the phrase that we translate free choice is what he calls the liberum arbitrium. But what he really, I think, has in mind is that the will or the voluntas is basically love or desire.
Mm-hmm.
So that which you find attractive. And he has a pretty integrated, I think, intellectualist and volitionalist conception of this. So it's connected to your beliefs, like what is the good?
Mm-hmm.
You'll find what you think is good attractive, but then it's also emotional. What do I like? What draws me?
Mm-hmm.
And he talks famously, he kind of uses, I mean, he doesn't have a conception of gravity, but he sort of uses a gravity-like metaphor in the Confessions to talk about this, that which pulls us in
Mm-hmm.
is our loves. And so that for him is the fundamental locus of all talk about human agency. And the voluntas then has, as like an offshoot, liberum arbitrium, it has free choice. But for him, that especially in his latest works, it's, I think, quite clear that does not mean choice among different possibilities necessarily. And sometimes I think it's better to translate it a power of assent or a power of consent. And I think it goes back to his conception of the self as being quite complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the reason he wants to talk about the liberum arbitrium or free choice is that he thinks we can have very complex relationships to ourselves. And so you might find yourself drawn to something. In the Confessions, he famously mentions his mother struggled with alcoholism at a certain point. But she didn't want to be attracted to wine. And she hid it from people, and eventually she gave it up because she was deeply conflicted about it. And this is a very characteristic Augustinian situation. You're torn and divided. And that can happen at various levels. So you can be torn in your fundamental desires. I want to please myself. I want to please God. How do I relate these basic desires?
Mm-hmm.
But it can also happen in like a hierarchical way where you can deeply want to please God, but have some other desire for something. And then like have a second order desire about your first order desires where you think, well, I don't want to be the kind of person who's just shallow and is giving myself what I want. I want a deep relationship to the good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think that your listeners who know Harry Frankfurt's work, there's something connected there with Augustine and the idea of second order beliefs or volitions about your first order beliefs. And I think that's what something like that is what Augustine's going for when he talks about the liberum arbitrium.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In short, the liberum arbitrium is in service of or like a outworking of your fundamental desires.
Mm-hmm.
So your free choice does not happen at some autonomous, independent level. It is always going to be an expression of what do you love and how much do you love something.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about a little bit about the Latin. Are there different Latin words for love that would be relevant to this context of like what we're attracted to?
Yeah, caritas or charity is Augustine's typical word. But he'll talk about eros as well.
Is there a distinction between those that makes a difference?
Yeah, I think that eros for him is eros is a good, given, so it does not connotate lust or anything like that. It's just attraction to the good. And in a Neoplatonic context, you've been given that by the good or the divine. And it's your nature to want to return to the good and to participate it in some way.
Yeah.
And this is an insight that Augustine thinks the pagan philosophers have got right.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's not always a sense that the love is interested in you. That which you love is interested in you. So maybe the divine is indifferent. And so part of the attraction of Christianity for Augustine is that this is not a story about an indifferent world where fates control things in a way that is not considerate of human persons.
Yeah.
Christians believe in a personal God who has a intentionality and interests and plans. And so to talk about caritas is to talk about the love that is given by a God who is not needy.
Mm-hmm.
And so this transforms the conception of eros, I think, in certain ways, because it's not just a wanting to be filled kind of love, but also a kind of merciful generosity out of the overflow of divine goodness. And this can transform our loves too. And so in that sense, caritas, I think, for Augustine is a theologically kind of elevated conception of love.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, I would be careful to say Augustine is fairly consistent, I think, in his terminology, but also not always consistent. Yeah. And one of the things I think been heavily implying already is, he does change his views on various things over time. And so you just have to be really careful to pay attention to when texts were written, and then to kind of think about, is his way of talking changing? Is it on some kind of trajectory?
Right.
And this is why I recommended reading a couple of really late texts, like on Grace and Free Choice, because I think by the time he's at the end of his life, partly because he's had all these polemical arguments with pretty smart opponents, he's had to kind of clarify his views and become a little bit more consistent. Early on, I think sometimes he kind of wanted to have his libertarian Neoplatonism with his more compatibilist, like African-oriented views about divine grace. And then he can make everybody happy.
Right.
Yeah.
But turned out that it wouldn't work that way. And so he had to be kind of like increasingly rigorous and honest with himself about some of these things too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this has already come up, but one of the ideas very closely associated with Augustine is that of original sin. And as you mentioned, some of the Eastern kind of Greek-speaking contemporaries and then after Augustine, theologians kind of reject his view of original sin to part ways with him. Could you say a bit about what Augustine thought about original sin and then about how he thinks sin affects human agency?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think my headline line about this topic is that Augustine's views are pessimistic but hopeful. So I'll try to say a little bit about each. As a totally geeky side note, which I hope some of your listeners will be interested in, there's a possibility that early in his career, Augustine was attracted to Neoplatonic views that were associated with the theologian Origen, and that Origen and some of his followers, including maybe Augustine at a younger age, were attracted to the idea that God makes us as souls in some kind of abstract place, a spiritual place. And then we make a choice to fall because we reject divine perfection for who knows what reason. There couldn't be a good reason, but it happens apparently. And then you fall into bodies. And then this life is a world of punishment. And Augustine seems to have at least believed some version of that as a Manichaean. And there are interesting connections between some of those ideas and ideas about original sin as Augustine develops it later. But Origen becomes persona non grata in the church just before Augustine comes on the scene. So Augustine doesn't talk much about Origen or whether he had any influence from Origen. I kind of think that Augustine probably was partly converted actually to Origenist Neoplatonism, maybe early. And that then he has to find ways to move away from that without talking about it openly as his career goes on. Anyway, so there's a lot to say about the development of Augustine's doctrine of original sin. That, I think, is part of the story. In its late kind of like final form, original sin is partly a story about human history. So there is a biblical idea that Adam and Eve, the first couple, are made by God in a perfect state, and then they fall into sin and reject the goodness of God. And then that their choice has a ramifying effect throughout all of human history. So that's what I call the primal sin, the first sin. But I think it's important to note that the doctrine of original sin is more than that doctrine. So it's not just a doctrine about there was a thing that happened in the past and it was bad, even though Augustine believes that. But original sin, the thing that makes it distinctive is its idea of what I call an inherited fault. So Augustine thinks that everybody who's a descendant of Adam and Eve inherits a kind of flaw in their human nature, in their constitution. And I think the easiest way to understand this problem that we all have is that it's misguided desires. So like a twisted voluntas, or he uses the word concupiscence. But we, of course, always think that means sex, and that's not what Augustine, I mean, of course, that's part of the problem for him, but the problem is much bigger. As I say, it connects with ideas about ambition, and there are many forms that it can take, actually. Augustine is inspired to this view, not primarily actually by looking around empirically and saying like, wow, this Roman Empire kind of is horrible, or, oh, human beings are totally not trustworthy. I mean, he kind of thinks these things to some degree, but he is actually inspired by theological practices of the church. So the controversies about original sin get started actually because people in the African and Italian churches are arguing about why do they baptize infants some of the time. And in fact, they didn't always baptize infants, it seems like, but they would baptize them, especially if they thought the infant might die. And of course, in this day, infant mortality rates were absurdly high. So there was a lot of baptizing of infants. And then the question was, what was the point of that? Why did they do it? And Augustine's argument was, well, you're baptizing them to cleanse them of sin so that God can accept them into heaven. So he had an argument for original sin based on church practice. And then he also had a theological argument based on the role of Jesus as Redeemer. And he wanted to argue that all human beings must have some kind of fault that they need to be redeemed from. And that's the point of Jesus. Otherwise, Jesus is kind of wasting his time. So he wants to argue that absolutely everybody needs this salvation that's being offered by Jesus. So these are the things that gets his doctrine of original sin started theologically. I think sometimes people think that his view is that original sin is always pride, that people think too much of themselves, and that's the kind of like the fundamental form that sin takes. But I actually think he thinks that's only true of the first sins. So the primal sins of the angels and of humans are probably sins of pride. How could you say no to God when God is like walking with you in the garden? Right. How could you say no to that unless you've got some kind of crazy kind of pride? But after that, he actually says original sin can take many, many forms because sin is just a twisting of the good. It's a privation, as he famously says. It's a destructiveness of the good. And so the good is multifarious and many-factored, and so is sin, because it is this warping power. And so many people have fundamental sins that are not maybe pride, but could be like anxiety or like lack of self-respect. He says in one passage that many people sin with weeping. So the suggestion is that you might not even want to have the sin that you're beset with, but you find it within yourself. And this is a universal feature, he thinks, of the human race. And so that's the pessimistic account of human nature that he has to offer. I think the hopeful part of it is that it's provoked to and tied to this doctrine of grace that I talked about. So the point of baptism is actually that you already know that this sin has been forgiven. So you start actually with the doctrine of universal forgiveness in baptism and through Christ, and then you infer the sin from that. And the doctrine of original sin, I think, interestingly enough, has a kind of an equalizing effect in the Roman context, where at least the intellectuals, the great philosophers, they thought that a small number of sages had the power to rise above the common herd and live a life of true wisdom and goodness. And most people were too weak or foolish for this. But a few great men could achieve these moral and spiritual heights. And negatively, Augustine's doctrine of original sin says, well, actually, nobody can do this, and we will all fail at it in one way or another. But that also then has a kind of a flattening effect to humble the aspirations of the great and say, well, actually, you're not that much better than, Augustine's parishioners, essentially, are just as good or bad, but in different ways, maybe, as the famous Stoic philosophers. And so there's a kind of equality of humanity in this doctrine.
Yeah.
And then the doctrine of divine grace that Augustine develops says everybody can become perfected. Everybody can be embraced by the divine. Everybody has a chance to go to heaven. So here too, there's a kind of a hope that everyone shares. So the pessimism of his view is tied in interesting ways to a kind of hopefulness where he actually elevates the possibilities of the common figure in Roman society who would have been kind of seen as just a hopeless case. So Augustine kind of wants to say, well, yeah, we're all hopeless cases, but it's okay. God will help.
Right. Yeah. So what is his conception of responsibility? How does it relate to this doctrine of original sin?
Yeah, I think it's so even in Augustine's own day, immediately, the reason there was a Pelagian controversy, this really a controversy about original sin seems so unfair. That can't be appropriate. Why would God fault, even a baby that can't talk or something like that? That doesn't seem right. So there are all these questions about agency. And the doctrine of grace that Augustine subscribes to as well, he thinks that God always has the priority. At least in his latest works, he thinks this. So it raises all these worries about, is he kind of making God out to be the only serious agent and undermining human capacity to make a difference? And I think this forces Augustine then to develop his compatibilist conception of agency. I should say, of course, Augustine doesn't have these words at all. So compatibilism, what the heck is that? He never, there aren't clear boundaries here. So I think reading as we look back, it's really very clear that the Pelagians some of them were actually pretty good, maybe like source libertarians, or at least something like that, source libertarians. But, they don't have any of this terminology. So it's you have to be very careful not to impute more consistency to Augustine's views than he actually offers.
Yeah.
But I do think implicitly, it's pretty clear he's making a bunch of compatibilist moves. And he's very insistent, like in Grace and Free Choice, he says, well, the reason we believe in the will and in free choice is that the Bible consistently offers commands. And if you don't follow the commands, God blames you. Or if you do, then you get rewarded and praised. And that's because of our agential abilities, he wants to say. And so the task then is for him to give an account of how can it be the case that God's grace is always decisive and that human beings' agency matters in some way. How can we respect human agency? And so I think he basically wants to say that the locus of responsibility is on willing. Whatever is expressed in your voluntas, that which you voluntarily are, the loves that you have, that is your agency. That is the fundamental form of your agency. And it marks you in a significant way as a significant actor. So it may be, he likes to use the Apostle Paul, for instance, as an example. It may be that God gives you your loves in a somewhat revolutionary manner. So Paul is an opponent of Christianity. Jesus smacks him in the face and knocks him off his, I forget, it's a donkey, and tells him stop being bad, become one of my people. And Paul's kind of like, okay. And I guess he didn't have a choice. But that doesn't mean that God took away Paul's agency for Augustine. What it means is that God gave Paul a new structure of desire such that he was now able to love better.
Yeah.
And for Augustine, it's really, I think, important at this point to mention his eudaimonism, his view that morality is connected to happiness, but not in a psychological sense, or not merely in a psychological sense. So it's connected to flourishing. It's connected to truly good lives.
Mm-hmm.
And we all want that. That's what we want, whether we know it or not. And that, in fact, is the only thing that will make us happy. So you might think that you're going to be happy if you achieve your ambition and become a powerful rhetorician at the heart of the empire, but you might find out that it, in fact, does not satisfy you, and that you want something more. You're always wanting something more. And in the end, maybe the only thing that can satisfy you is the infinite goodness of the divine. And if God can help turn you towards God's own infinite goodness, then God is doing you a favor. He's giving you what you want. So when St. Paul gets kind of like forcibly converted, this kind of forces, in a sense, what Paul wanted. Even though if you had asked him beforehand, hey, did you want to become a Christian? He would have been like, no, those people are horrible. But God is enhancing his agency, not getting rid of it. So to summarize, Augustine, I think, believes that we're responsible for what we love and what we see as good. And for him, these are the same thing in many ways. And that's pretty much it. I mean, so there's more to say, but you can get praised or blamed basically because what you care about, what you love, what matters to you, that matters.
Yeah.
Well, keeping in mind your warning about trying to make him more consistent than he is, or even just trying to sort people from, his day and age into contemporary camps, I do want to talk a little bit about his position and how we should sort him. So people disagree about like where he fits in the landscape of the contemporary free will debate. As you've already mentioned, you read him as a compatibilist, at least in his later works about free will and determinism, whereas others read him as a libertarian, someone who's an incompatibilist, but who affirms that we have free will. What reasons do people give for reading him as a libertarian? And then why do you disagree and read him as a compatibilist?
Yeah, I mean, this problem was a source of great trouble to me earlier. And when I was in grad school and I was trying to figure out what to make of a bunch of his writings, and the fact that there are all these different, quite radically different accounts oftentimes of Augustine's views was a deep puzzle for me. I think there are probably two central answers. One is the thing we said before about how Augustine is really important and you don't want to disagree with him.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency to be like, well, whatever it is that I think is true, Augustine probably said the same thing.
Of course.
So like he's totally on my side. Right. So that's one thing that I think has had a distorting influence. Unfortunately, people don't honestly sometimes want to say, well, here's what he said, and it was totally wrong. So that, at least in the history of, lots of people have been happy to say Augustine was wrong in like the last century or so, but prior to that, it wasn't okay. So that's one thing. But another thing is that Augustine himself does seem to have changed his views. And I think it's relatively widely accepted now that Augustine was probably converted to a Neoplatonist libertarianism when he was younger, when he was still in Italy. And then gradually, as he read more and more of the Bible, and as he worked through his views about these doctrinal practices like infant baptism and praying and asking for divine forgiveness, all that kind of thing, he sort of thought the libertarian view doesn't work. One key thing that he thought about more and more as he got older was actually the relationship of the human and divine nature in Christ. This is something we'll talk about maybe more later, but for him, this is a central test case of what freedom looks like. And it's notable for him that Jesus can't do bad stuff. And the human will is kind of like, God doesn't exactly take a poll of the human nature and say, hey, would you like to be joined to the divine and like eternally committed to the good? That's not how it works. It's just like bestowed. And so the human nature is like, hooray, but it couldn't have said not hooray. So in what sense is it free? And Augustine wants to say, well, of course it has to be the most, it's not just like a little bit free or like, okay, we like got by on this one. Like this is the best. This is the absolutely most free. So these, I think, are the things that move him towards a compatibilist view over time. But it takes him a while to work through it all. And so there are early works that I think are pretty easy to read as libertarian, like the On Free Choice of the Will text.
Mm-hmm.
And then he starts moving away from the view, but he doesn't simply abandon it. And so you get a bunch of intermediate texts where he is pretty compatibilist, but not entirely compatibilist. And so that's pretty confusing.
Right.
So you got to spend a lot of time reading a whole lot of texts and setting them up in a narrative arc
Mm-hmm.
to kind of get the story about how it all works. And that, I think, is a story that we've worked out pretty well at this point. I'm pretty happy with the story we've worked out, but I think
Right.
it has taken a great deal of time for scholars to work these things through.
Mm-hmm.
And there are trade-offs in terms of what maybe he gives up over time, too. I think early on, he's attracted to something like a free will defense as an explanation for why evil exists and why God permits sin.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, he doesn't find the free will defense very promising anymore. And as a compatibilist, he can't do much with it. So he kind of converts to a skeptical theism where he's sort of like, yeah, I don't really know what God is up to here. And so maybe that's a kind of a loss.
Mm.
I think certainly from the point of view of some of his contemporaries, it would have been.
Right.
So there are complicated trade-offs. And this may be one of the reasons for his hesitancy over time, too, to fully shed certain views.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You've also written on predestination and on Augustine's view in particular. Could you describe his view on this doctrine and how it differs from others in the Christian tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, wait, let me say one more thing about the previous couple topics about Augustine's compatibilism.
Mm-hmm.
I think his late stuff where he reflects on concupiscence is a really helpful entry point for thinking about his conception of responsibility, because he'll often worry that all of us violate the commandment not to covet, which he reads very broadly as incorporating like almost all forms of idolatry. So any misguided love counts, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But he basically says we all break this commandment constantly. And he wants to say because of baptism, we get forgiven. So on the one hand, it's not counted against you as sin if you're baptized. But he does clearly think on a virtue conception of the good life that it's an imperfection. And so there's a sense in which I think he still wants to blame everybody just for having misguided desires, even if they don't act on them.
Mm.
And so that was a striking fact for me, that for him, if you just have the wrong loves in your heart, but maybe you're good, maybe you're like a well-developed, mature person who's suppressed those desires. But he'll worry about stuff like, am I too attracted when I smell food? Like, does it distract me from thinking about the important things? And he's like, this is a sign of my imperfection.
Huh.
And part of me wants to say, like, go easy on yourself. But concept is, I think, really interesting.
Yeah.
I think he wants to say, if this is part of your volitional, like the shape of your volitional character, then it counts for something, morally speaking. And so this is one of the things that led me to read him as a fairly radical kind of like quality of will type compatibilist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought maybe that would be helpful to mention.
Yeah, it also seems like people who are really committed to total depravity would love that because they're like, oh, yeah, you're way worse than you thought.
Yeah, that's right. Although, the privation account of sin for Augustine means that total depravity can only go so far.
Mm-hmm.
So like you're totally depraved in the sense that every part of you is warped.
Right.
But you're not. Actually, one of the few things he really solidly takes back in his reconsiderations, the text that he wrote at the end of his career where he kind of like listed all of his work and sort of like reflected on it. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really admit to being wrong about that many things. But one of the things that he says he was wrong about is at one point in a work, I forget which one, but he said basically the image of God is lost because of original sin. Mm-hmm. And he says, actually, you know what? That was wrong. Mm-hmm. It can't be lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To be is to be good. And so there must always be good in us in order for us to be sinners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you could be totally depraved, but you're also always totally good in the sense that there's always going to be good in every part of you. even though maybe there's also going to be evil
Mm-hmm.
in every part of you.
That's interesting.
So in that sense, he still thinks we're fundamentally for God. We're oriented towards God,
Yeah.
And that's probably a good transition to the topic of predestination.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, I think for him, predestination is like the claim that God is committed to giving people what they want, actually. And again, maybe you don't know it. Maybe that's not something you're aware of. But as a matter of fact, what will actually fulfill you would be unification with the divine. And so for him, predestination is always God's gracious gift of participation in the life of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an outgrowth of his conception of providence, where he thinks, well, God is committed to taking care of the world and does not leave it behind. It's not just that God makes us and then says, do your thing.
Right.
It's important, though, to note, I think, that predestination is not the same as a doctrine of complete divine determinism. At least I think it's not in Augustine's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of times people think, if you believe in predestination, you think that God determines everything. But as far as I can tell, Augustine's actually pretty clear that that's not what he thinks, because he thinks that it goes against the definition of sin for God to determine everything. If God was making sin happen in some active case, then it would be harder to say that it's against the divine will. And then it would get confusing as to what the heck you meant when you called it sin.
Mm-hmm.
So sin is permitted by God, but it's not determined by God. It's just left as a possibility. So for Augustine, predestination is a doctrine of last things, and it emphasizes the priority of divine agency. And here I think it's useful to note that this doctrine is not just an outgrowth of his ideas about sin. So the reason that God needs to actively be the one who brings us into the divine life is not just because we're sinners. It's actually ontologically required that the divine take us into it, because we are not the sort of things that can elevate ourselves in that way. So even if we hadn't sinned, you would still need divine outreach projects. You'd still need divine help.
Mm-hmm.
Grace for Augustine is a fundamental necessity of human nature. And sin, of course, makes you need it even more, for sure. But it would have, I think, always have been the case that participation in the divine life would have had to be a gift that was taken as part of God's initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So predestination does not concern like everyday stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like Augustine doesn't think God predestines whether you're going to eat bacon tomorrow or something like that. But you were gonna.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the need for grace, like that necessity in human nature, is because we're created things on Augustine's view, and so like creation is itself a kind of grace, or is it that even once we're created, there's something about our finitude or something about human nature, even apart from the fall, that makes us in need of further grace? That's a great point. Yeah, in the debates with the Pelagians, actually, the Pelagians say, well, we believe that everything is by grace. It's just that free will of a libertarian sort is given to us as the fundamental grace of creation. Mm-hmm. And then God says, like, do your thing. And Augustine's like, yes, of course, we all believe in that kind of grace. But that's not the kind of grace I'm talking about here. Mm-hmm. And he ends up making a distinction between all these different levels of grace. Mm-hmm. And you can get some of them, but not all of them. And if you're predestined, you need to get all of them. And ultimately, if you're predestined, you get the grace of perseverance, mm-hmm. which means you're going to adhere to the divine perpetually. Yeah. And that's like the really reassuring one. Like, then I'm definitely participating in the good, right. And I can't fall again. So he does think of nature as a kind of grace. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But then I think he sort of thinks that God wanted Adam and Eve to have something that they contributed, and that this is partly maybe why God sort of lets them fall, or makes it possible that they could fall, because God wants them to do something too, and doesn't want it just to be in like a one-sided relationship. Mm-hmm. So instead of making them the most perfect they can be, God sets them up so that they're perfectly innocent and pure, but haven't yet realized their full potential, mm-hmm. and then gives them a chance to develop. And so there's supposed to be, like, even in the best case, there's supposed to be a series of graces that Adam and Eve get to help bring them through this developmental process. Mm-hmm. A kind of
childhood growth into adulthood kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just a necessary fact of being a material created being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's controversial, of course, to believe in predestination because it raises questions about free will.
Right.
I should note that most Christians, at least in the West, have wanted to say that they believe in predestination.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think you end up getting is really like what I distinguish as strong and weak doctrines of predestination. So Augustine's doctrine is strong. He thinks that God has the absolute priority
Mm-hmm.
to determine who gets invited into the divine life ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
But you get weaker versions, like I think Anselm's version, for instance, where God sort of offers the invitation and then knows who's going to say yes or no,
Mm-hmm.
but isn't determining who's going to say yes or no, leaves it open.
Mm-hmm.
But Anselm still wants that. I think a certain kind of Augustinian would say, well, that's not really predestination, actually.
Right.
But Anselm's going to want to say, I definitely also believe in predestination.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that's because there's precedent in biblical texts about predestination? People want to preserve that, or do you think it's I don't want to part ways from Augustine, even if I'm using, predestination to mean something slightly weaker?
Great question. Yeah, I just wrote this little. I wrote part of a book helping hopefully to promote Christian, Muslim, and Jewish dialogue about predestination.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the reasons why predestination is just such a kind of like a common theological topic in Christian thought as opposed to Jewish thought
Mm-hmm.
is that predestination is explicitly mentioned in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So you got all this stuff about election in the Hebrew Bible that could imply predestination,
Right.
but it doesn't exactly have to. But then you get the Pauline letters and sort of like predestination's there.
Yeah.
So even Orthodox Christians in the East have official conciliar statements saying that they are committed to predestination.
Mm-hmm.
Although what they mean by predestination is basically the same thing that Calvinists condemn as heresy. So it's, but it's, people want to kind of stick to the biblical language here.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, this is kind of a huge question to leave for the end, but what are some main objections to Augustine's views on free will and predestination? And do you think Augustine has good responses to these objections?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I'll try to keep it brief. I would say there are two main objections to simplify. One, we've already kind of talked about a bit, the question of fair attribution of responsibility. If God's agency has the priority in the way that Augustine's doctrine of grace and his doctrine of predestination suggest,
Mm-hmm.
how's that fair to us? Does it give us a fair shake? And I think one of the deep motives for many libertarians, Christian or anti-Christian, is just a sense that Augustine's views are unjust.
Yeah.
They don't give people a chance. And so that's one big objection. I think a second worry is about divine goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine's kind of putting God in charge of a lot. He's not a determinist, so maybe not everything, but still an awful lot. And then that raises these very hard questions about, well, like, why does God not predestine everybody to heaven then? Like, what's up with that?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of mean-spirited. And what about all the evil and suffering in the world in the meantime?
Mm-hmm.
God could make everybody nicer, seems like.
Mm-hmm.
Why not do the St. Paul thing to everybody?
Right.
Like you might find yourself really wishing that some of your faculty colleagues would also have road to Damascus experiences.
Right.
And maybe you feel like everybody's life would be better. And so Augustine's views raise questions about divine goodness too. And so I guess I think that Augustine can do a pretty good job on the fairness questions. One of the things he says that I think is worth noting about attribution of human responsibility, I just looked at Grace and Free Choice briefly this morning, actually, and there's a passage there where he says, if you act out of ignorance, he says, God will still blame you for what you love. And maybe you didn't know it was wrong, but if it is wrong, you're still going to get blamed for it. But he does say that the fires of hell will be weaker for you. So he has some kind of theory of gradations
Mm-hmm.
of responsibility. And I think this is an important, he doesn't always elaborate this a lot, but I think it's important to say when he attributes responsibility for things that we don't have much control of, he's not attributing a huge amount of responsibility. He's just attributing like some kind of minimal degree of responsibility. And he sort of just wants to say, well, look, if this is what a person stands for, then they can be praised or blamed for that to a degree. But if it's something they chose for themselves knowingly, then it would be a lot more significant.
Yeah.
And so he does want to have a kind of proportionate sense of responsibility. And I don't think he ever says this anywhere, but I have the sense that he thinks that maybe if there was libertarian free choice, because as a compatibilist, I don't think he has to deny that there are ever libertarian free choices.
Sure.
He's just denying that those are required for responsibility, right? But let's say that Adam and Eve's fall, the initial sin, maybe that's a libertarian free choice. He's not sure what it is, right?
Yeah.
He's like, that was just weird. But maybe it was a libertarian free choice. That would make it a lot worse.
Yeah.
They'd be like hyper responsible for that. So there are all these different degrees of responsibility. And I guess I find that pretty intuitively appealing. If you think that he's too mean about it, I think that's connected to worries about his doctrine of hell that I would distinguish from his theory of free will or agency or responsibility.
Yeah.
So there's a theory of punishment in Augustine that can seem really unattractive, but I think it's conceptually important to separate that from his attributionist or quality of will approach when it comes to explaining how you can be considered responsible for original sin or your goodness under the effects of divine grace.
Yeah.
So I think on the free will side, the fair attribution question, I think Augustine can do pretty well. Maybe with a little bit of help, to clarify, well, this is what he actually probably meant, or take it too far, or something like that. I think the harder question, though, for him is the question about God's goodness. Because, as I said, God is so powerful on his view. So why not have a better world?
Right.
And why not be some kind of universalist about salvation, ultimately? And there, I guess, I think his view should be even more hopeful than it is. So I kind of disagree with him, I think, on this aspect of his doctrine of predestination. I sort of think you can appropriate his doctrine of predestination quite easily as a universalist. And then it's ultimately hopeful.
Right.
And I'm what some people call a hopeful universalist. So I'm not so sure because I don't know. I don't feel like we know enough.
Yeah.
And the Bible does talk a lot about hell, and I don't want to just say forget all that.
Right.
And I have some good friends who are very confident universalists, and they kind of want to say, well, the Bible doesn't really mean that hell stuff the way you think, And I'm like, I don't know. Augustine wasn't that crazy when he read, these passages.
Yeah.
So I want to push the logic of God's goodness maybe in a different direction than Augustine would. But I also think his skeptical theism, there's something unavoidable about that. I mean, there are just hard questions. There is a lot of suffering that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And you can do really fancy work on theodicy, and you're still just going to have a lot of unanswered questions, it seems to me. But I don't find it super attractive to then go like an open theist route and say, well, actually, God's not really in charge. And so it's too bad, but actually God's trying really hard and this is the best God can do. That's not very appealing either, it seems to me. So I kind of think Augustine makes the basic right move here. He wants to say, God's goodness to us is in certain fundamental ways deeply inscrutable. And we have to hope that there's more to this story and that at some point it will make sense to us once it's explained. But maybe we're not in a position to comprehend that now.
Yeah.
And so that kind of skeptical theism, I think, is Augustine's best response to the divine goodness sort of criticism.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks so much, Jesse. This has been great. If listeners want to follow your work, where can they find you online?
So I posted quite a few of my published articles to academia.edu.
Nice.
So if people are interested, they could find my site on academia and read like pre-publication versions of my work, especially if they have trouble with firewalls or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And my books are not there. I thought that would violate my copyright agreements. Although I did just find out that AI has subsumed all of my books, so
Okay.
maybe you can get it to spit them out somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Just ask the right prompt.
It's got to be in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, academia.edu. And also wanted to highlight, I just published an article, just came out online in Studies in Christian Ethics. It's an article about Augustine's view of pagan virtue.
Oh, cool.
Where I argue that Augustine had a more positive view of pagans and their possibilities for virtue than he's been made out to have. And that City of God is up to something much more complex when he's criticizing pagans.
Yeah.
So I would say maybe people could look for that. That summarizes some of the themes that we've talked about here, especially Augustine's eudaimonism and some of his ideas about the priority of divine grace.
Yeah. Very cool.
I'm interested to check that out. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks again, Jesse.
It's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah. Same here. In the next episode, we'll talk with John Marenbone about Boethius on free will.